Welcome to Disability 24/7 with Christine Brown.
And Kyle Pigman, we are excited to have you.
This is a podcast by people with disabilities, for people with disabilities, and about disability issues.
Today's episode is all about voting with disabilities.
Voting is a fundamental part of our democracy, and unfortunately, people with disabilities have struggled with barriers to voting for a long time, as we know. Also, this year's election is a pivotal moment, and we want to make sure you all are informed going into November.
Thanks, Christine. Our speakers today, our guest today is Michelle Bishop, the manager of voting access and engagement for the National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN for short, and Nazek, the policy affairs manager from the League of Women Voters of Ohio. We are so excited to have Michelle and Nazek on this episode to share with us a little more about voting during this election cycle. How are you both doing, Nazek and Michelle?
Great. Thank you so much for having us on. I'm really excited to be here. As a follower of the podcast, I'm excited to be on.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on. We're very excited to talk about voting today, and I hope that this will be useful for people.
Can you both tell us a little bit about yourself, the work you do normally for voting?
Sure, I can go ahead. So I work for an organization called the National Disability Rights Network. You can call us NDRN for short. And you can find us at ndrn.org. We are based in Washington, D.C. I'm in the D.C. area right now, but we are actually a national membership association for what's called the Protection and Advocacy Network. It was created by Congress and is federally mandated. So there is a PNA, as we call it, in every state and DC and every US territory. And Disability Rights Ohio is actually one of them for our Ohio listeners. I'm a big fan of DRO. So my job primarily is to support the amazing work that they're doing on the ground every day around access to the vote for people with disabilities. They are working with elections officials to make sure they're making good decisions about voting equipment and polling places and poll worker training and the things that make elections work for voters with disabilities. They're talking to people with disabilities about getting registered to vote, knowing your rights, making your plan to vote so that we are participating in elections and all of that good work that really makes things happen. And I'm just someone who gets to support the amazing things that they're doing, as well as a little bit of, some of the national stuff, like paying attention to federal legislation that impacts the vote and that sort of thing.
Nazek can go.
Yeah, so in my capacity as policy affairs manager of the league, I work to support 34 local leagues around Ohio that do community grassroots work to educate voters. I work on voter education, outreach, and advocacy, and there are many things that fall under that. But one of the things that we do as we get closer to election season is talk to different groups of people who have been historically disenfranchised, and help them to make sure that they know everything that they need to know to successfully cast their ballot.
Thank you, Nazek. The questions were going to be for the both of you. What are your organizations doing to voter access for people with disabilities, despite some states trying to limit access to the right to vote? And I'll let Nazek answer first.
Yeah, well, this year is actually a big year for us. We have worked with the ACLU of Ohio and another person who has a disability to bring a suit against the state for what we believe is a violation of voting rights. And the judgment came out on that case and the judge agreed with us. And so we were able to get a little bit of relief in some areas of how we can better assist voters with disabilities. And so Ohio law, when a voter with when any voter casts a ballot by mail, it has a very specific definition of who can help you, and it's an enumerated list. So there's a list of specific people that you can give your mail ballot to, for example, deliver to the Board of Elections or to put in the post for you. And for people with disabilities who don't have somebody within that list to help them, then it becomes very difficult for them. And our co-plaintiff was one of those people who had an elderly mother that could not help her. And she was not allowed, the person who helps her in her day-to-day tasks was legally prohibited from helping her to cast her mail ballot. And she was not able to any longer go and vote in person. It was just really like an undue burden for her. And so now with this decision, it makes it so that for any person with a disability, a person of their choice can help them to deliver their mail ballot. So that was the decision of the judge. However, the Secretary of State has passed a directive since then that has kind of narrowed what the judge has allowed. And what that means basically is for anybody who has cast a ballot and by mail, but has not put it on the mail, but that they returned it to the Board of Elections, which that's a preference for a lot of people because they don't necessarily like to put something in the mail. They actually have to park their car and go inside and deliver it to a person that works at the Board of Elections, and they have to fill out a form saying, I am so-and-so, and I am helping a person with a disability who is so-and-so. So they unfortunately have added an extra unnecessary step for persons who help another person with a disability. It's a small win, and we keep pushing to make small wins, but that's what we have been working on kind of like on a macro level for the past several months.
Thank you, Nazek. Now it's Michelle's turn since she handles the national one because it's been happening all across the country, even in Louisiana.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was going to say. Nazek, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's so important. And we are absolutely seeing exactly like Kyle said, we're seeing this all over the country where states are trying to pass or passing laws that limit who can help you when you want to vote, whether or not you're going to vote in person or you're going to vote by mail or put your ballot in a drop box or whatever you're planning to do. That right is actually protected by federal law. It's in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If you're a person with a disability, you can choose whoever you want to help you vote. The only limits on that is that it can't be your employer or your union representative, right? So if you have all these laws in your state that are saying, well, it also can't be, it can't be someone who works in the residential facility you live in, or it has to be a caretaker or a family member or something like that. They can't do those things. So we've been supporting our network to fight back against those violations where we see them coming up in multiple states. We've also, especially since the 2020 election, been really concerned about how people are voting who live in long-term care facilities. If you live in a nursing home or a rehabilitation center or something like that, we've learned, especially in 2020, that a lot of voters who live in those types of settings, they get to vote because either the local election staff come in and help them vote, or friends and family come in and help them vote. And during COVID, they weren't allowed to do that for very good reason, right? Nursing homes weren't letting people in because they didn't want the residents to get COVID. Completely makes sense. But it really hurt access to the vote for a lot of those folks. So we've been trying to think of better solutions that don't depend on the goodwill of others to come in and provide assistance, and for people to be able to vote, as independently as possible, which is also your right under federal law. So those are a couple of the big things we've been looking at. In addition to, we're just so close to the election now that it's all about making sure people are registered, that they check their registration and make sure it's up to date, that they're making their plan for how they want to vote and they've got all their resources in place, checking their ballot. I have to say, I have to tell you this. I tell people all the time to go to vote411.org to learn what's going to be on their ballot, which is a League of Women Voters website. People probably think I work for the League of Women Voters, which would not me. I'm such a fan. But I love that website and I use it when I get ready to vote because there's always like ballot measures on your ballot. It's like vote yes or no on Proposition A. And then you have this paragraph that's written in legalese. I have no idea what it means. And vote 411 is like, here's what it says on your ballot. Here's a plain language version of that. If I say yes, I'm saying I want this to happen. If I vote no, I'm saying I want this to happen. Like I use that when I vote and I do this for a living. So promoting
Well,
resources like that as well.
thank you. That makes my heart so happy. I appreciate that. So sometimes those little pieces of validation are just so helpful to just keep the work going.
Right? Right. Sometimes it feels like we're like sending resources out into the void and you don't know that people actually use them all the time. So know
Yes.
that even other people who work in voting for a living are using that resource because it's amazing.
Thank you.
And getting people ready for the election. That's been our big focus. We've also been, I think Kyle knows this because we've talked about it a little bit, really focused on people getting bad information and the ability to use AI now to make stuff that looks really convincing, right? Really convincing pictures or videos or audio that aren't real that give you fake information. That's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And we worry that it's a big problem for people with disabilities. Like if you use AI to make a fake video of maybe your Secretary of State saying that the election date's being moved, which is not true, right? The easiest way to tell it's a fake, because the audio can be really convincing, is that the video doesn't look quite right. So if you're blind or low vision, you're at such a disadvantage to be able to weed out what's real and what's not when your social media and everything is, there's so much of this being thrown at you. So we've been trying to prepare people for that as well and make sure they know to go to like Disability Rights Ohio, League of Women Voters Ohio, and that's where you can get good information and they can help you figure out what's real and what's trying to trick you.
Now Christine's question.
So unfortunately, I'm sure you know that people with disabilities do have a lot of barriers to voting. How can barriers be broken to make polling places more accessible for people with disabilities? I can say to you from what I heard that there was a talk to where people going to the election place wherever they're at, what if the person is in a wheelchair, they can't get inside? Doesn't that mean that the voting people have to come outside to assist them to do it outside? Because I still hear that there are challenges with that area.
Yeah, I can help with that. So, I mean, there are, as both of you know better than I do, such a variety of disabilities, right? And there are actually a lot of allowances in the law to help people with disabilities. But the biggest barrier is that most people don't know that those allowances exist. So let's use the example that you put forward. Can somebody come outside to help you to vote? Yes, that's called curbside voting. And most people don't, this is something that we struggle with every election. Most people don't know that that's something that exists. Ideally, there is supposed to be a sign outside of every early vote location and every poll center on election day that is dedicated parking for people who are accessing curbside voting, where one Republican and one Democrat will come outside to your car and they will administer your ballot. And it doesn't need to be, oh, this is, not an ADA accessible building. You don't even need to tell them what your disability is. You don't need to justify it. Unfortunately, there have been cases sometimes where a poll worker might, try to say something like, oh, it's only for people who can't walk or something like that. It is not okay for the poll worker to say that. And one of the things that we do before election day is make sure that people have access to the election protection hotline to call us if anything like that happens, which I'll share before the end of this. but any person who needs to access curbside voting can do so. And so that is something that it's actually a little bit easier to do if you go to an early vote center, because there are signs typically outside of every early vote center that I know of in Ohio. They typically have assigned multiple signs, parking and parking spaces with a phone number to call once you get there, and people will come out to you. Now, because there are so many polling locations on election day, not everybody does this in the best way. But if you want to access curbside voting on election day, I would highly suggest that you call your Board of Elections before election day and let them know, my name is such and such, this is my polling location, and I would like to vote curbside. And they will give you the instructions on how to do that. So they might give you, for example, the phone number of the voting location manager, and you would call them when you get there, and then they send 2 people outside. So again, there's really a list of things that we can talk about to help people with disabilities vote, but that's definitely one of the bigger things. The other thing that I would mention is that a lot of people don't know about, for people who are in a confined setting, whether that is a jail or a nursing home, or even in your own home, for some reason, if you can't vote, leave your own home, there is an allowance for I don't want to misquote the form, but there is a special form that you fill out where election workers will come and administer your ballot to you from wherever you are. This is, I would highly suggest that you submit that application right away, because if you get too close, there is a deadline for it, but I would really just hand it in right away. If you get too close, you just might not be able to access that resource. But this is particularly helpful for people who have no ability to get to, no ability to like vote by mail or to get to a polling location or an early vote center. And so that's another big resource to know. And all of these things are on the Secretary of State's website. If you look up voting with a disability in Ohio, you'll find that on the Secretary of State's website.
Thank you, Nazek. Now Michelle can answer.
That was amazing information. I love all of it. I think the only thing I can add to that to be helpful. Oh, I can think of 2 things actually. One is that they should also come and make sure you're able to vote if you're hospitalized. Depending on your disability, for a lot of us, it's like every day is a little different, right? And so you may not know. I mean, and it happens. Sometimes you go into the hospital on an emergency basis. You didn't know it was coming. So you haven't gotten an absentee ballot or something like that. You were planning on going to your polling place on election day. And now you can't. They should come, but make sure they know. Call your local election board. Make sure the staff in the hospital know so they don't miss you, so you're able to vote. But we're also part of election protection. We love the election protection effort. I talk a lot to voters who say, oh, I would have called election protection, but I was able to vote, right? The poll workers were really nice and they helped me and we figured something out and I was able to vote. And I'm like, that's cool, right? One of the main reasons you call election protection is if you're not able to vote and you're being denied your right to vote. You absolutely want to call on election day. Don't give up your right to vote. Election protection folks are ready to help you. They'll make sure you're able to vote. But I also want people with disabilities to call if you have a question before you go vote. Election protection also gets a lot of calls about, where's my polling place and is it accessible to me? What if I can't stand in line for a really long time? What are my options, right? Don't hesitate to call with those questions, as well as, folks like Disability Rights Ohio that would love to help you with that. But also, I want people to call election protection if they had a problem voting, even if the poll workers were great and even if you were able to cast your ballot. Because if your polling place was inaccessible and they had to figure out what to do, or they weren't offering curbside voting correctly and it had to be fixed or any of those things, we want to know about them so we can make sure it doesn't happen next time. So even if you're able to vote, if something happened that is not supposed to happen under the state law or under federal law, we want to know about it, because folks like League of Women Voters Ohio, Disability Rights Ohio are going to get out there and advocate to make sure it's right next time you go vote. So you don't have to do extra advocacy for yourself, or the poll workers don't have to figure out a workaround or any of those things. And sometimes we hear I can think of a great example. We got a call one time at election protection because there was a polling place. It's not in Ohio, it was in another state, and it had an accessible entrance that was around the corner, but the poll workers didn't know about it. So they didn't have the door open and they didn't have signage up. And a man showed up who used a wheelchair. And so what voters were doing was parking and then walking up a grassy hillside to get into the polling place. And there was another way around if you couldn't do that, but nobody knew. So the poll workers, who were really trying to be helpful and had really good intentions, decided to lift him in his wheelchair and carry him up a grassy hillside. And I'm glad I can see some folks' faces as I say that, because that's actually really dangerous. They had good intentions, but that's incredibly dangerous. If they dropped him, he could have gotten very seriously injured. And so that one, just what sticks with me about that story was the person who called to report it wasn't the voter in the wheelchair. It was somebody else in line who saw it and thought, that doesn't seem right. And so that sticks with me because I'm like, great, I'm glad that person called. But when that happens to people with disabilities, I want us to call too, right? Even if the poll workers were lovely and they really wanted him to vote and they figured something out, none of that should have happened. So you call and let us know, even if you're able to cast your ballot, because we want to advocate to make sure those things don't happen next time.
It's a really good point, Michelle. We do review all of that call information afterwards, and we use it to advocate for better practices in the future, to pick up on any trends that are going on. Sometimes these problems are very like locally, we see in a certain county that there's a high number of, people with disabilities that had problems or ballot shortages or whatever it is. And sometimes, we might trace it back to something like poll workers were not being properly trained in a certain county, for example. And so really every call is very helpful. And as Michelle noted, like, you can start calling today if you have questions about your ballot, where you vote, really anything related to the election.
Why is voting important for people with disabilities? My take is voting is a fundamental right and should not be taken for granted. We're one of the few countries that we have that we can vote for anybody who we want, regardless of party or affiliation. And also, and there's still some people who don't understand the right to vote. Even I encountered a woman years ago. She said she wasn't going to vote. She was depriving her right to vote, and people with disabilities can register and have somebody assist them depending on hope, because what Nazek said, it had been very helpful in Ohio. And I'll let Christine
Well,
go.
I really think my perspective is that voting is a human right, and we have rights of our voices in what we want to see be done, both local, state, and federal levels.
I'll let Michelle answer that one. Why is voting important, especially for people with disabilities?
Really glad that you asked this question, because we talk a lot about what your rights are when you go to vote and all those kinds of things and helping people get ready to vote. But the beginning of that is that people have to understand why voting matters so much and why it's something they need to do in the first place. And to me, voting is the right on which all of our other rights depend. If we don't use our vote, elected officials make decisions about everything that matters to our lives, especially as people with disabilities. If we want to choose where we live, whether or not that's in the community or in a group home or in a residential facility or wherever it is, if you want that choice, that is a decision that's made by the government. If you want to go to school, you want to get a job, anything that affects our ability as people with disabilities, have healthcare, have accessible housing, accessible transportation, all those things are determined by our elected officials. And if we don't vote, we don't really get a say in that. And they know, right? There's statistics out there that shows, what percentage of people with disabilities are voting or registered to vote. And if I know those numbers and they're on the internet, your elected officials know it too. So if you go to them and you say, this is what we as people with disabilities need, And they know, like, people with disabilities aren't voting, so they didn't give me this job and they won't take this job away from me if I don't represent what it is that they want. Then we're at a disadvantage. If we vote, no matter who you're voting for, to be honest, whoever you choose, whether or not it's, a candidate from one party or another, or you're writing somebody in, whatever it is, when you cast that ballot, you're increasing that number. That shows that people with disabilities vote. We're paying attention and this matters to us. And we're going to vote for people who talk to our community, about our community, and represent our interests. And that's power that we need to have if we want to have choice in our lives, which we didn't always have as people with disabilities. It really wasn't that long ago that we didn't get to choose where we lived, especially if we wanted to live in our own homes in the community. And we didn't have the Americans with Disabilities Act until 1990. That wasn't that long ago, that people who use wheelchairs were throwing themselves out of their wheelchairs and crawling up the steps of the United States Capitol on their hands to fight for the Americans with Disabilities Act to be passed. It wasn't that long ago. We could very easily go back to those days if we don't take our vote and use it. And so sometimes I feel like people think my one little vote, is just my one little vote, and maybe it doesn't make a big difference. And it does, because you put them all together. And that's how you get hundreds of votes and thousands of votes and millions of votes that determine who's going to win an election. And we talk about it a lot when there's a presidential election coming up, because the president is very important. The president does have a lot of power, but every election matters, right? The president can't do whatever they want. Bills go through Congress. So who your senators and representatives are matter. Your local mayor might have a say in funding for accessible transportation. County sheriffs are really powerful. They get to determine if, people who have mental health disabilities, if they are struggling in public, are going to end up being thrown in jail or be diverted to resources that will help them to thrive in the community. Your local school board makes decisions about how integrated people with disabilities are going to be in schools and things like that. So every election matters. And when you get down to some of those local elections, some of them are actually decided by one little vote. So that one little vote it's just so powerful. And it's how we've gotten as far as we have in the disability rights movement, and we have to keep moving forward. So we have to use that vote.
Thank you, Michelle. Let Nazek answer.
Everything that Michelle said, 100%. I will just add to that our elected leaders in any position should be a representation of their whole constituency. If we only had able-bodied white men voting, then our mayor or our senator or our president or whoever is only a representation of the people who are voting for him, right? And that doesn't make for a healthy democracy, and that doesn't make for a healthy society. As Michelle noted, the people who are in elected office, they affect every part of our life. And when we have somebody in an elected office that's making decisions on our behalf, but not taking us into consideration, then a kind of resentment builds up, and really like a disdain for the community that we live in, the society that we live in. And it just makes for a very unhealthy democracy. And it's not even a democracy when people when people's voting rights are being taken away. And so really Michelle covered, so much of the essence of, the issue. But I think looking at it also from the perspective of, is the person in office a representation of everyone that they are supposed to represent and in their constituency is a really big issue that we need to be thinking more about.
Thank you, Nazek. And Christine can ask this next question about the average person.
So how can the average person 18 and over get registered to vote?
So in Ohio, to get registered to vote, there's one of the two things that you can do. You can register online if you have a driver's license. You would be required to put in the last 4 digits of your social security number and a driver's license number. Now, many people with disabilities don't necessarily have a valid driver's license. And so if that is the case, then you would need to register by paper. And most local public agencies or county public agencies should be able to have that paper registration form, and you would just hand it back to them. So you can get registered at Jobs and Family Services or at a library or any number of public agencies. You just go in and you ask to register to vote, and they will help you with that form and collect it on your behalf.
Thank you, Nazek. Now Michelle can answer because she handles the national one.
The only thing I could add to that is that I bet there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast who are like Christine and Kyle, where it's like, you're already registered, you're voting, you are part of the process, you know your rights, you know the issues, right? I would be shocked if there weren't some really fierce advocates who listen to this podcast. So I would say to those folks, if you're like, I'm already registered, I know, tell everyone you know to get registered. Get other people registered, right? Go out and talk to other people with disabilities about why our vote is so important. Help them get registered, help them make a plan to vote, and let's get as many people out as we can on election day.
I'll
Thank
just
you,
add one more
Michelle.
thing to that, if that's okay.
Good.
There have been a lot of issues in Ohio lately and really around the country, but I follow Ohio specifically in people unjustly being removed or mistakenly being removed from the voter rolls. Ohio has a supplemental process in which they're supposed to clean the voter rolls from people who have moved out of the state or who have passed away. But a lot of times people are mistakenly removed from the voter rolls, and then they show up to vote and their vote doesn't count because they're not registered to vote. So there's been actually even, I know that this is not about citizenship, but there's also been increasing issues about citizenship and people who are new citizens having their eligibility questioned as well. And so every single person, whether you are registered or not registered, you have a task, which is either register to vote or check your voter registration status. So everybody should be doing that.
Thank you, Nazek. And we have seen lots of information about voting in the upcoming election, but want to make it easy for our listeners and viewers without persuading listeners and viewers to vote one way or the other. There are guides you two know that might make it easier for those with disabilities to make their choice. I'll let Nazek go.
Well, Michelle mentioned vote411.org, so I would really encourage everybody to get on vote411.org. And you can find, first of all the information about your ballot, what's going to be on your ballot. We send voter questionnaires to every candidate on the ballot about just general questions about their views on education, the environment, any number of issues, criminal justice. And anybody who answers the questionnaire, any candidate who answers the questionnaire, you can see their answers there. But also any issues that are on the ballot, a lot of times the statewide issue, for example, is a complicated one. Like we have statewide issue one in Ohio about the redistricting, the citizens not
Citizens
politician
vote and
redistricting.
making the choice instead of politicians.
Yeah, that's right. So the citizens, not politicians redistricting amendment, and quite frankly, it's a complicated issue. And so we will put out language about that. That should be published by next week, actually, on Vote 411, that will break down the issue and say, if you vote yes, this is what it means. And if you vote no, this is what it means. So that's a little bit of self-advertising there, but I would encourage you to get on vote411.org and do some research.
Thanks, Nazek. I'll let Michelle answer.
All right, I feel like I have to self-advertise now too, because I already hyped up vote411.org and it's not even our resource. But now you guys know it's mine that I personally use and one of my favorites. So I second that for sure. We also have some resources. We tend to put out our stuff for voters on our website, voterswithdisabilities.org. And there's some resources up there. A lot of it is know your rights kind of stuff. So if you're thinking like, what are my rights to have someone help me to vote? What are my rights if I live in an institution and some of those types of things? We have guides up there that talk about that. We also are big fans of plain language resources. Self-advocates becoming empowered have some stuff up at govoter.org, and Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN.org. Also do some great plain language resources that we really recommend. If you're in Ohio, definitely Disability Rights Ohio is going to be a great resource for voters with disabilities. I imagine you have some listeners outside of Ohio because I'm a listener and I live in Virginia. So if you're in another state and you're like, Disability Rights Ohio can help me, you can go to our website, ndrn.org. And up in the top left, there's a link you can click on where you can find the PNA in your state. So you can find the Disability Rights Ohio of wherever you are, and they'll have information that is good for your state as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Now Christine can.
So there are many resources out regarding election day, like from you all at the League of Women Voters and the election hotline from Disability Rights Ohio. Do either of you know of or want to share any other resources that our audience may want to know about? I think you both actually just said this about the 411 and the other resources. So again, even going on to Disability Rights Ohio or looking up on the other resources, we will have it in the chat and in the video for everybody.
I would also recommend the Secretary of State's website. I can't speak to other states, but in Ohio, there is a wealth of information at voteohio.org. And there is really all the information that you could possibly need to vote with a disability. There's links to all the forms there that you need, whether it be to register to vote or to, vote absentee, or if you are voting in a confined setting. If you are suddenly hospitalized and you need to vote, any of these situations, you can also find numbers to all of the county boards of elections there if you need to contact your county board of election. So it's a lot to navigate on that website, and you can always call the league or call election protection and we can help you do that. But that is a good resource if you're willing to wade in deep to all the election information.
Thank you. Do you, either of you have anything else to share about voting for the upcoming election?
I would say the only other thing I think folks should do to prepare, because we talked about, get registered or check your registration, make your plan to vote, all those things, good advice. I think the last thing you want to do, because we also talked about some resources to help you prepare, but I think you want to have your election day resources with you as well. Like, who will I call if something goes wrong? And hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully you make your plan and everything goes perfectly smoothly and you have a great experience voting. But if that doesn't happen, you want to make sure you have the phone numbers for Disability Rights Ohio, for League of Women Voters Ohio. You want to have the election protection phone numbers. The main line is that our 866 Our Vote, which I know y'all are going to promote as well, but they have multiple hotlines that also are friendly for other languages. There's a hotline that's for English and Spanish, English and Arabic, and another hotline that's English in usually about 9 different Asian languages. I won't even list them because I will get it wrong. It changes sometimes. National Association of the Deaf also has a video hotline you can find online for speakers of ASL as well. And there's usually some other ways to get in touch with folks, like election protection, like a text message option, a chat through the website, and things like that if calling on the phone is something that just doesn't work for you. But I know you've got hotlines and good resources for people to call, so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks,
Also,
Michelle. I'll let
I-
Nazek.
I think I need to correct myself. I think I might have said that the Ohio Secretary of State's website is voteohio.org. If I did say that, it is actually the Secretary of State's the Secretary of State of Ohio website is voteohio.gov. So I just want to make sure that I said that correctly.
Thank you, Nazek, and
Okay.
let Christine ask our final tip.
We also wanted to share a tip with you all today Today's tip is all about making sure you get in your registration to vote. Make sure to get in your registration by October 7th, which is fastly approaching. Then make sure to vote on November 5th or before. If you are voting absentee, remember that a family member that is close to you can take your ballot in for you or drop it off on election day.
Thank you, Christine. And because some states may have different voter registration deadlines, there's been a few states that let you register and vote the same day. Michelle can attest to that.
It's true. That happens in a number of states. It's really cool. You can get registered on the day of and go vote on the day of. I wish they did that everywhere. I'll put that out there. I hope they add it everywhere.
And final words for Nazek and Michelle.
Well, just thank you so much for having us here and for paying attention to this issue of voting, and that this is really just the step one. Like, we should not just be voting and not thinking about civic participation for the rest of the year. People with disabilities should be engaged with their elected officials throughout the year on issues that matter to them. So a hot tip that I always tell people is that have your elected officials like on speed dial, and when something concerns you, just give them a call. Just be like, hey, this thing is going on and I have a question or I have a concern. And it's a really good, easy way to like just make sure you have like a relationship with the office of an elected official. And the closer they are, so the more local they are, the easier it is to have that relationship, right? So if it's somebody that's, on your city council, board of education, those are going to be people that you could possibly potentially know and have an easy meeting with, right? And kind of so on and so forth.
Thank you, Nazek, and I'll let Michelle finish up. And
I have to say, I think that's so true. I knew a person with a disability when I used to live in the great state of Missouri who had befriended one of her state senators by inviting him over to have coffee and talk about the issues. And he accepted the invitation, which was amazing. And it became a thing where he would come to her house for coffee and tea, and the neighbors and a bunch of people with disabilities would show up and they would talk about the issues. It's doable, right? That's a true story. It's quite possible to have those kinds of relationships that are really important, because that's how our legislators know us and the issues that matter to us. They don't know that stuff without us, right? Nobody knows us like we know us. But what I wanted to say kind of for a final thought, okay, wait, I have two. One is, we talk a lot about making your plan to vote. Make sure you make a plan for how you're going to celebrate after you vote, and make voting fun and be excited about participating in democracy. I like to put on my I voted sticker and take a selfie and put it online so everyone knows I voted. But I highly recommend ice cream. Actually, it's going to be November. It might be cold for ice cream in Ohio in November. Pizza. Everyone go vote and then get together and have pizza together and celebrate having voted. Pizza's delicious and warm in November.
yeah.
But the last thing I really wanted to say was that we talk a lot, or at least I talk a lot, about what the barriers are for voting with a person as a person with a disability. And I have to talk about it. We have to call those things out if we want to advocate for them to change. But I want to say, for people with disabilities who are listening, if you're thinking, man, there's these barriers to voting, maybe I'm not going to do this, don't do that. Do not do that. For a lot of you, you're going to make your plan. You're going to have your resources and your assistance ready, and you're going to be able to vote, and it's going to be a smooth process, and you're going to be surprised and thrilled. But even if you experience barriers when you go to vote, you should never let that stop you. Your vote is just too important and it matters too much. And especially, we were talking about laws that are getting passed that aren't okay, and people suing to try to stop them and things like that. And so every time you come up against a barrier when you go to vote, what you should think in your head is not, this is too hard. You should think, wow, somebody spent a lot of time and money trying to stop me from voting. My vote must be really important. And then crash through that barrier and make it happen. Don't ever forfeit your right to vote.
Thank you, Michelle. I want to thank Michelle Bishop and Nazek Hapasha for joining us today for the Disability 24/7 podcast about voting. And one thing I will say about, I do eat ice cream year round, even in the wintertime. Thank you so much, gang, and Christine can close us out.
So again, thanks for joining us for the episode 10 of Disability 24/7. We look forward to hearing from you. Please find us on Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, and on Instagram at Disability 247. And please subscribe. We thank you for your time and thanks for joining today to share. We might come back to you for some other episode in the future.